What is spirituality? I had a conversation this week with someone in our community that touched on this question. Now, this might be obvious and maybe it's not, but spirituality is something that I personally think about a lot, something that I personally care about a lot. But as a rabbi, it's actually not something that I talk about a lot, at least not directly. I'm now in my 9th year as an ordained rabbi, beginning my 4th year as senior rabbi of Adat Shalom. And in my time serving this community, I've had direct conversations about spirituality with members of our community just a few times, not very often at all. When I served a community in Seattle as assistant rabbi, right after I was ordained, I spoke about spirituality even less often than that. It was in that year, in 2018 and 2019, that I started to wonder if maybe spirituality wasn't really a topic people wanted to talk to their rabbi about. Let me explain. For pretty much as long as I can remember, I've sought out friends and teachers and communities who thought about spirituality, who wanted to talk about spirituality. In my rabbinic education, I got connected with Beit Teshuvah, a Jewish addiction rehab not too far from here, right near Venice and National. Quickly, Rabbi Mark Borovitz and his wife Harriet Rosetto became two of my most important teachers. They made their careers as forces for healing, fusing Judaism and the 12 steps with social work and therapy, working to save Jewish and non-Jewish lives from the fatal disease of addiction. Now, those of us who know of them already know. Those who don't probably won't be surprised to hear. Rabbi Mark and Harriet were certainly unconventional and maybe a bit controversial. But for me as a rabbinic student, hungry for spirituality and not really finding what I needed elsewhere, they gave me the opportunity to speak with people about spirituality every time I showed up to the Beit Teshuvah campus as a student rabbi. In that context, in that community, spirituality, finding a connection to something outside yourself, finding a meaning in life that feels satisfying, was a matter of life and death. Now, in 2018 and 2019, after ordination, serving as an assistant rabbi in Seattle, I worked with a number of young couples. Most of these couples were interfaith with a non-Jewish partner learning about Judaism as the couples considered issues of conversion and marriage. One day, I was meeting with a young woman in a conversion process who was engaged to a Jewish man. They'd been planning their wedding in Israel, and she came to my office and told me that their wedding had been called off, had been indefinitely postponed. Of course, I was surprised and sad and disappointed. I wanted to console her and bring comfort. I wasn't exactly sure what to say to her, and so I asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" It was a delicate moment. I knew I had years of student internship experience having conversations with people in very difficult, very sad situations, people who needed to talk about what they'd been through. And I knew the context I found myself in with this young woman was very different. I couldn't help but extend a spiritual hand to this vulnerable person to try to bring connection and meaning to this moment of pain and loss. So I did in the best way I knew how. She took a moment and she responded to me and said, "No, I don't want to talk about it." Of course, I said, "Okay." We went right back to business, where she was in her conversion process, what did she need to do next, is everything on track? And I learned from that moment that the role of rabbi can create both intimacy and distance. On the one hand, a person might want to tell their rabbi their marriage has been called off. On the other hand, that person might not really want their rabbi to know very much about how or why that happened. On the one hand, a rabbi is a spiritual leader. Everybody knows that. But on the other hand, when a rabbi talks about God or mitzvot, it can kind of be a bit on the nose if the rabbi isn't careful. Spirituality, of course, is something that it's essential for a rabbi to address. But how to address it, when to address it, how to step close and how to step back, how to discern what spirituality means for an individual and for a community. Let's just say they don't cover all the details of that in rabbinical school. This week's parashah is Matot Maseh, combined parashah, the end of the book of Numbers, the 4th of the 5 books of Torah. One section of this parashah that seems to be a perennial topic of conversation is the topic of cities of refuge. I remember one of the summers I was at Camp Ramah, we did a whole session about this, as the Parsha is always read in the summertime. And I was speaking with my husband this week about this topic. Right away, he told me a story of when he studied this topic and when he was in high school. This topic, cities of refuge, gives us a lot to unpack. Our Parsha explains God commands Moses to command the Israelites to establish cities of refuge once they enter the Holy Land. These cities will be places to which a person can flee if that person accidentally kills another person. I was learning the Parashah with my students earlier this week. After a quick overview of the combined Parsha start to finish, we decided to go straight to this topic. We had some discussion about how the Torah defines deliberate versus accidental killing, about the Torah's establishment of a legal system, and about the many questions left unanswered by our Parashah that are explored later on in the Talmud in Masechet Sanhedrin. But the piece of our conversation that stuck with me the most was a question of spirituality. The instructions in the Torah explain, in the words of our Torah commentary, that the divine presence can't dwell in a land contaminated by murder, an offense that pollutes the earth and leads to God's abandonment of the sanctuary and the people. Bloodshed pollutes the land, and then the land becomes barren. But with the blood of the slayer, the go'el, the blood avenger, the next of kin, that neutralizes the deleterious effect of the blood of the slain, restoring the ecologic balance. The earth again yields its fruit. So we have this concept that murder creates a type of spiritual mess and needs a type of spiritual cleanup. The next of kin of the deceased becomes an agent of the community. And when the next of kin kills the murderer, he does this not for revenge, but to restore a spiritual balance. We read this with our modern sensibilities and ask, how does this make sense? Even if we can accept that capital punishment is just, which some of us, or perhaps many of us, cannot, how is this an issue of spiritual mess rather than an issue of justice? Now we get into the situation of accidental killing, and this is where the cities of refuge come in. If a person kills another person accidentally, the relationship between the manslayer and the next of kin is a bit different. The manslayer must go and live in a city of refuge, and the next of kin must stay away. If the manslayer leaves the city of refuge, the next of kin may indeed kill the manslayer. But the idea is that the manslayer lives out his life in the city of refuge, and this restores the spiritual balance. The bloodshed of accidental killing does pollute the land, but the cleanup process is different. So we read this with our modern sensibilities. Maybe this is making a little bit more sense, but don't worry, the Torah's understanding of spiritual mess and spiritual cleanup is again going to defy logic, as there's one more detail about the city of refuge, which is, when the manslayer is living out his life in the city of refuge, there is a scenario in which he's able to leave and go back to his home and his life. The manslayer can leave the city of refuge when the high priest dies. This is because the high priest is uniquely able to bring atonement, has a unique role in the responsibility of spiritual cleanup. Each year on Yom Kippur, the priest brings atonement for all Israel through the rituals of Yom Kippur. Thus, the death of the high priest brings atonement for the inadvertent manslayer. Studying this text with my students, the feeling of our collective striving to comprehend what was going on here was almost palpable in the air of the room. We were trying to ride the wave of this Torah spirituality, but we were struggling to find our balance on the surfboard. Which way was up? And then one student reminded us of another concept from Torah of spiritual mess and spiritual cleanup, which we don't really address in this week's parashah, the concept of tumah and tahara, usually and imperfectly translated as spiritual purity and spiritual impurity. For the purposes of our discussion today, perhaps we can understand tumah to mean needs spiritual cleanup, and tahara meaning doesn't need spiritual cleanup. But often we misunderstand these concepts. We think that tumah means impure, and impure means bad. What gets lost in translation is that spiritual mess and spiritual cleanup, tumah and tahara, are a normal part of human life. Human bodies become tameh, spiritually messy, in totally normal and healthy activities such as childbirth, menstruation, and sexual intimacy. Human bodies also become tameh in the very sad yet very normal case of a person dying, of a person passing away. Being in contact with or close to a human body that is no longer alive transmits tum'ah, makes a person spiritually messy. This is very sad, but this is also normal. There's a straightforward fix. The Torah gives all sorts of instructions for spiritual cleanup. They vary a bit depending on the situation, but the process of spiritual cleanup always involves immersing in a mikveh. A mikveh is a ritual bath. It's kind of the size and shape of a hot tub. An immersion in the mikveh always completes the process of spiritual cleanup. A person comes out of the mikveh in a state of tahara. Their spiritual balance has been restored on an individual level. Now, this week's parashah, giving instructions for what to do in the case a person is killed accidentally or intentionally, aims to restore spiritual balance on a communal level. Spiritual cleanup is a normal part of life because spiritual mess is also a normal part of life. On a community level, on a societal level, even murder and manslaughter are a part of life. We can't stop these things from happening. We can't prevent the spiritual mess. That's why the Torah gives us a process of spiritual cleanup, a way to make things right. In our modern times, we don't understand spiritual mess and spiritual cleanup in the same way that our parashah understands these concepts. The Torah was speaking about the land of Israel in the times of the Holy Temple, and of course, things are very different today. But this week, speaking about these concepts with my students, and this week, speaking about spirituality in an individual conversation, makes me very thoughtful about how much things have changed for our people since ancient times and how much things have remained the same. On a communal level, we still do have spiritual needs. Of course we have spiritual needs. And these spiritual needs are felt by individuals in many different ways at many different times. Sometimes we feel our spirituality in massive moments of life and death and intimacy. Sometimes we feel our spirituality like an itch or a tickle as we struggle to connect to something beyond ourselves that feels meaningful and important. And for some of us, this conversation about spirituality might feel foolish and might feel like there's no place for this in shul. As my husband said, when I told him about our study of the cities of refuge in this week's parashah, he said, "You talked about spirituality? You didn't have a conversation about fairness, right and wrong, and justice?" So here's what I want us to think about as we come to the conclusion of Shabbat morning service, as we share time and conversation with one another today over bagels, as we move together as a community into this new week. I want us to think about, what does spirituality mean to me? Is it even something I need? Now, if it isn't, that's okay. Spiritual needs aren't a mandatory requirement or for being Jewish or even coming to a synagogue. But I think for some of us, maybe even for many of us, we come to this community and we come to this celebration of Shabbat because we are looking for connection and meaning. Perhaps we're coming here feeling like we're a bit of a spiritual mess today and we could really use some cleanup. That's why we're coming to this room. I want us to think about these things, and I even want us to consider talking about these things, maybe to one another, maybe to a friend, maybe to a therapist, maybe even to me as your rabbi if that isn't too on the nose. May we all find the connection we seek. And may we all walk out of here today feeling a little bit more spiritually balanced than we did when we came in. Shabbat Shalom.